All right, okay, let's get started. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your patience, and thank you very, very much to the community leaders who stepped up to this task that the County Council assigned you. This is the last meeting of this council's Health and Human Services Committee. Mr. Rice will presumably continue on the Health and Human Services Committee on the next council. And so what we've gotten, with great thanks to all of you who will be presenting, is a working document that will provide a blueprint, I hope, for elected officials moving forward. So there is a transition in leadership here in the county, but this document will be very, very helpful to the next group of leaders who step up to the HHS responsibilities, both in the legislative branch and in the executive branch. So I really want to thank the members of the Developmental Disabilities Advisory Committee of the Commission on People with Disabilities, and it's an excellent, thorough document. We're not going to be able to go through every line of it here, but we'll benefit from the overview that I know that you're ready to present. So, Ms. McMillan, who will present?
I think what we'd like to do is let everybody at the table introduce themselves, and then I'm going to take you through the slides, and I'm going to ask that they all freely chime in when they're ready to on the individual topics. They each have different levels of expertise with different things that are their subject areas, although everybody is familiar with everything. So if we can sort of just do it that way, and we'll have a give and take, but we have a series of slides that'll just walk you through an overview of the report and its recommendations. That's
great, and I know you too, Ms. McMillan, were involved in working with the Commission on People with Disabilities and helping to craft the report.
Yes. So if Susan, why don't you start by introducing yourself? You have to press your button.
Hold it down?
Nope, just press.
I'm Sue Hartung, and I chair the DD committee, subcommittee for the Commission on People with Disabilities and the parent of 2 adult children with developmental disabilities.
I'm Claire Funkhauser. I'm a member of the committee. I'm a former chair of the Commission for People with Disabilities from a long time ago. I have a 44-year-old son with autism.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Mayo, Administrator for Community Support Network and Aging and Disability Services, HHS.
And I'm Susan Ingram. I'm the Director of Community Support Services and have acted as a representative of Interact on this committee since its beginning. And I just want to also thank Mr. Leventhal for the foresight in asking for this report to be done, because it was a really educational and productive experience for those of us on the committee, and I am hopeful it will be helpful to the council. So thank you for having that leadership.
Thank you, Susan.
Tim Weens. I'm the Executive Director of Jubilee Association of Maryland and the co-chair of Interact, and I would like to echo Susan's comments and thank you, Councilmember Leventhal, for your, not only this report, but your leadership throughout your time here. It's really, truly been impressive. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Karen Morgan. I'm with the Treatment and Learning Centers. I'm a member of the Commission on People with Disabilities, and I'd also like to thank you for your leadership over the years and having this group come back together again.
Well, you're all very kind. I have really felt that the Health and Human Services Committee was the best committee for many reasons. Lives depend on it. The work that we do here directly touches the lives of people who, but for the involvement of government, would not be able to make it independently. And I think that's what has been so meaningful for me, and I know for Mr. Rice and other colleagues who've served with me on this committee. Montgomery County is highly favored. It's a county of great resources, and we're all very fortunate to live here. We're fortunate to be able to afford to live here, even though it can be a struggle. So there are many, many people who are doing very, very well in Montgomery County, and county government has to respond to them and serve them and make sure that they have excellent access to libraries and excellent roads and parks and schools. But the constituents that we're talking about today are constituents who really, really need a government on their side. But for the involvement of government, they just wouldn't make it. So, so I'm looking forward to hearing the findings and recommendations of the task force, and I'm very confident, because the work that we've done in this committee has never been controversial with other council members, that you know, we would delve into the issues. We would make sure that those who were caretakers for the developmentally disabled were adequately compensated. We made sure that when other support was needed for specific organizations, sometimes capital needs, that we were there to respond. But the rest of the county, we never had a debate. The rest of the council never said, oh my gosh, no, that's too much money, or that's not a priority. So with 5 council members continuing, I'm confident that the county council will continue to be responsive and sympathetic, and I'm very confident that our next county executive will as well. But this document will be very helpful in that regard.
So I just, as an overview, wanted to say that the work group and the report is in response to Council Resolution 18989. But I also do want to acknowledge that because of competing demands on council staff, we actually were not able to follow the exact construct of the resolution, and that is why the DD Advisory Committee of the Commission on People with Disabilities was so gracious to help us out and to give up their regular meeting time and change a little bit in terms of membership to participate and allow us to get this information back to the council. So they gave up their meetings from June through November, and we used their regular meeting time, and I really cannot thank them and all the other people who joined. All the members of the DD Advisory Group were invited to join. Other departments and agencies were invited to join per the resolution. Everybody was welcome to come. Some people could come maybe just for one meeting. Some people came for more, but we tried not to exclude anyone from the conversation. And so I just wanted to say that as a start also, it was very interesting. Several of the participants in this work group also were part of a 2009 work group that transmitted a call to action, which is included as an appendices in the report. But they all agreed after we had some discussion that there still is a sense of urgency, but there also have been significant changes since 2009. And so the work group viewed this as an opportunity to update and to refresh the information and recommendations that are before the council. So the report is set up with system-wide recommendations. It has a section on our stories and experiences, data and trends on the number of people with IDD and waitlist information, information on FY19 county government funding, and then it has a series of white papers. And the report was structured this way really based on some of the comments from Councilmember Leventhal that he really wanted an educational and informational piece to leave behind. So this way people can, if they want some information on housing, they can pull out a section on housing and look at it sort of topic by topic. So we all hope that this will make the report useful to the next council and to the next executive. And also, I would just say, hopefully to the General Assembly delegation. I think that one of the things when you hear the recommendations, that you'll see several of them say involving the General Assembly delegation. Much of this is really a state function and a state responsibility. And the county will benefit if we can engage our delegation more in terms of advocacy and communication. I also just wanted to say, in terms of the structure of the report, that I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to make sure you read the section on our stories and experiences, which is at pages 11 through 16. And members of the work group and others who were actually asked by members of the work group to share some stories and experiences do so. And I think it really tells of the impact of all our policies and all of our programs in a way that you really can't by just having a description of the program. It really tells you what happens. It also tells you what happened when a system doesn't function correctly. And so there are some really compelling stories in there, and I hope that you'll be able to look at that. So just as a little bit of background before we get into the topics, I would just say there's information in your report, but you did have an OLO report on housing for people with developmental disabilities, and that report discussed in detail a lot of different methodology for estimating the number of people with IDD, and it used the Larson method to estimate that there are about 7,100 adults and 8,200 children with IDD in Montgomery County, and that would be at all levels of mild to severe on the spectrum. And it is an estimate because there is no specific question in the American Community Survey about a developmental disability. There is a question about a cognitive disability, so you'll see some differences there. And just as comparison, From 2013 to 17, the county population increased by 4.3%. The population aged 5 to 17 increased by 3.4%, but at the same time, you see that MCPS students aged 3 to 21 with autism increased by 17.9%, and with an intellectual disability by 5.3%. And those come from codes that are collected through the IEPs. And there is a CDC ongoing study, and it found that the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder for 8-year-olds, they track 8-year-old cohorts, went from 1 in 150 in 2002 to 1 in 59 in 2014. And Maryland is one of the study sites, and it actually had a higher rate in 2014 than the network as a whole, with 1 in 31 among boys and 1 in 139 among girls.
So I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair. In general, I think it's best if we could go through a whole slide presentation and hold on questions, but there's only 2 of us here, and I know we'll exercise some self-restraint. So I'm going to go ahead and ask a question. So the question is, do we think that the actual prevalence is on the rise, or do we think the frequency of diagnosis is greater? Which accounts for, I mean, this is a really dramatic increase in prevalence. Do we really think that many more people are autistic, or are we just recognizing it better?
So,
Or as Mr. Rice said, are more migrating to Montgomery County for whatever reason, services are good, or for whatever reason?
I think it's really probably a combination of all those factors, Mr. Leventhal. I do think that screening is much more effective. It starts at an earlier age. Pediatricians are much more versed in the signs of autism. I think that certainly is a factor. Maryland, Montgomery County in particular, has had a reputation for years for having excellent programs, especially in the school system for people with disabilities and especially autism. So I think that is an attraction for families. And I do think I think perhaps sometimes you can have perhaps a little bit wider umbrella than perhaps is used in other states' criteria for figuring out those numbers.
Well, if it's the case that more people are moving here, it certainly is because of the good reputation of organizations like CSS and Jubilee and Treatment and Learning Centers.
But it was just at our last meeting that Sean Latanzia pointed out there's a huge skyrocketing. I think it's in Western Maryland. It was either that or the Eastern Shore. So it's the state as a whole. And New Jersey and Maryland were the 2 states that had the highest increases in this. And it's definitely diagnosis is part of it. But as a teacher, there's a lot more autistic children. I think a lot more of them are higher functioning and included in the school system, and that diagnosis is broader. But the numbers are there.
Mr. Rice.
So I just wanted to ask a follow-up to that, because I just think back to when I was in school and imagine now in my experience with children who have autism, and thinking to myself that students who were diagnosed as just not paying attention, not being good students, not being good kids, having disciplinary issues, were probably along that line in terms of an autism scale and along that autism spectrum that just were never diagnosed. And so I'm curious as to whether misdiagnosis for a lot of this, or ignoring altogether the facts that were in front of some parents and others, if that contributes to this also. And I mean, I'm talking about back when I was in school, which was 20, 30 years ago, but still, I know it happens today, to where folks are resistant to diagnosis, whether it's parents, whether it's, so from that perspective, I'm just curious as to whether or not, now that more people are embracing, it's kind of like, it's not the same, but it's kind of similar to what we're seeing in our communities, our transgender and our gay and lesbian and homosexual communities, to where it wasn't okay to have that conversation about that. And so folks hid those kinds of things from being public. And now it seems like, oh, there are so many more people that are gay than there were before. Well, that's not the case. It's the same number of people. It's just that people feel more comfortable talking about it and acknowledging that it's happening. And so I'm curious as to, and I'm not saying that there aren't more. I'm just saying, is there some of it that's that as well? And I'm actually curious as to whether anybody's done any research that looks at how many of those kids that, were never diagnosed or those kinds of things that we now know were probably or were diagnosed later in life as being autistic or having any other sort of developmental disabilities?
I think the numbers are too new to have any longitudinal studies. I really think that's part of it. I think some of those students were always there. I teach 130 students a day. I have at least 2 autistic kids in every class that aren't officially diagnosed with it. But the difference between them and an ADD kid or a learning disabled student is clear to the teacher. So I think we are broadening that definition and that we are embracing it more too.
Now, when that happens, are you noticing that parents are more accepting or are some still resistant?
After a while, not immediately.
Yep.
Any diagnosis, I think when they're young, is hard to take.
Yep. Thank you.
There's information in your report about the wait lists and also the numbers of county residents that are receiving coordination of community services. And so I would just say that you'll see the spread here of the use of the different private providers for what we used to call resource coordination, and also the numbers who are on our wait lists, and particularly when you look at crisis resolution, crisis prevention. These are people who really need services immediately, but there's also current requests. There's people who are on the list that are receiving no services. So we have many, many people who are not receiving services, and it's unclear, frankly, when they might receive services. Sometimes it's many years before they do. A lot of our discussion was around the DDA's transformation plan, and it was announced in 2015. It has a vision that says people with developmental disabilities will have full lives in the communities of their choice where they are included, participate, and are active members. It calls for creating a flexible, person-centered, family-oriented system of support so people can have full lives. And it includes implementation of a new waiver structure, requirements for person-centered planning, implementation of the community settings rule, and that limits the number, among other things, limits the number of people with IDD that can participate in a program, restricts programs that have only participants with IDD, requires providers to have flexibility to respond to same-day individual requests for activities, and can limit the number of people in group homes. Some of this is federally driven, some of it's state-driven. The state is implementing the plan. I'm just going to tell you the next part about the rate-setting study, and then I actually am going to ask folks at the table to just give you some of their views about the transformation plan and the rate-setting study, because those really became very critical parts of almost every topic that we looked at. So the rate-setting study also began in 2015. Only phase 1 has been released, and now it's expected to be a 3-phase process. DDA has hired another consultant to review the assumptions in phase 1. That came after concerns were raised. And after review, a system-wide impact will be developed, new rates will be piloted, and additional feedback would be sought. Some of the concerns that were discussed in our group were the level of reimbursement for high-cost areas, like Montgomery County, non-reimbursement for work that is not face-to-face, and I think you'll hear from the participants today about sometimes a phone call is, really what you need to step in immediately, but they're not sure if they're going to have reimbursement around the work they need to do, and the timing and certainty of rate changes. And so I think I'd like to ask the participants if any of them would just like to give you some overview comments about the implementation of the transformation plan and also the rate-setting study.
Is my mic, yeah, it's still on. So it has been a long process, and it looks like it's going to be quite a bit longer. I think my summary would be that a lot of initiatives were started several years ago, and then they've kind of all come to a head at the same time. So the provider community is feeling pretty overwhelmed with the number of changes that are being expected without any understanding about how the funding will match with those changes. So we're getting clinical programmatic changes, such as the size of the home, or whether the home is owned by the provider or operated by the provider, or leased separately, because that's a different service now. Some of the definitions are different as to whether it includes transportation or it doesn't include transportation. Some of the definitions of behavioral supports changed in a way to make it much more specific, in that you had to divide psychology services into assessment and then the plan, and then how many units with very prescribed criteria and qualifications for the providers. The employment piece also underwent some changes in terms of what's going to be defined as integrated competitive employment. They're using a much more limited definition to be reimbursed for support in those kinds of things. So if someone's in a group, like 2 people got hired, for example, into a particular, even if it's paid by Wendy's or Burger King or any profit company, it might not meet the definition of competitive integrated employment, and therefore the support the people need to hold those jobs would not be reimbursed. The county's internship project, for example, would not meet the integrated competitive employment definition, most likely. So some of the folks who are on Schedule A jobs, or jobs that are sort of set-asides, is the best way to describe it, or contracts, will no longer meet an employment definition for supported employment. So there's a lot of concern among the community and individuals that it will actually decrease employment instead of improve employment outcomes, which is a stated goal of all of us, including DDA, to have an employment first state. So I think that the devil's always in the details, and once the details started to come out, it became worrisome as to how we will really make these the stated goals achievable if our hands are tied in each of the different services in these ways.
And so, Susan, these changes, for example, the definition of what qualifies as an employment program, these are being carried out in the rate-setting study? That's the vehicle to determine what reimbursement is allowed for which programs?
Right, so it becomes very intertwined, whereas initially it's defined in the new waiver and it gets approved by CMS, but then guidances come out which further define it. So it became more clear what the vision was from the state as to what they're going to call employment. And then rates, that definition is given to the rate consultants to decide what rates are appropriate for that service, because they need to include the components in there for that particular definition. So that was one of the problems with the first phase 1, was that the state had not provided the consultant, in his opinion, with a thorough explanation of what each service should include or not include. And therefore his rates were highly questionable as to how they were constructed.
So how much variance is there between what CMS prescribes and what the state DDA adopts? Who's really driving the car? Is it the feds or the state?
I'm sure that you'd get 5 different answers if you talk to 5 different providers. My personal professional viewpoint is that it's heavily being driven by the state and how they've decided to interpret it. What has been explained to me is that states really get to decide these things, and as long as they are within the broad guidelines of the feds, states can do it the way they want. That may or may not, I'm sure they have some limitations, and the state also has to deal with Medicaid. So it has an interesting relationship between DDA and Medicaid. So it's not that it's necessarily one party or the other that's the problem, because they become very interconnected very, very quickly once you delve into the details.
And how much input from the affected community is, how much input is the rate-setting study accepting or getting?
Well, they're getting some. There is a tech group, I've been sitting on that for quite a while now, of a few providers. There has been input from other stakeholders, including parent groups, et cetera. How much is accepted is a different issue. So more input is being given than is being accepted, and changes made. So it's been pretty painful. I mean, I'm not gonna, sugarcoat this. It's been very painful, and we're not there yet. So every time we think it's going to be one thing, then these huge problems arise, and then we get a hold on it or we get a reverse on it. So this whole rate thing was supposed to start July 1, this past July. It's now held up, and then it was next July, and then it's now delayed to January, and I don't see how they can make a January 2020 date. So we don't know right now even what the increase is in the regular state budget, because the 3.5 increase ended last June because they thought they'd have new rates. So I know that providers, the Coalition of Providers has put in a request to the governor to increase the DDA rates by 3.5% while we're waiting, for the next round of rate study information.
But you're still submitting claims and getting paid.
We're still submitting claims and getting paid
Under the old definition.
Under the old, well, some services, the old definition, some services, they're actually requiring us to use the new definition without a change in the rate. So it's pretty complicated and pretty confusing. The person-centered plan process is just started, and it's been challenging as well because it involves these different companies to all implement it with the provider and with the individual, and nobody quite knows what the process is yet. So we're struggling with that part too. We've got a change in how we're supposed to do behavioral services in terms of something called MANT is replacing something called BPS. So we're having to retrain staff on that. There's a new training for staff, incentive sort of for outcomes and training goals. The list is long. It's very, very long. So we're pretty challenged this year with keeping up with and complying with what we need to comply with. Meanwhile, there's no new regulations, so there's some conflict and concern on the provider's side as to what regulations will be held to by OHCQ, the Office of Healthcare Quality, when they come in to survey, because they haven't written new regulations that match the new waiver. So it's going to be a rough year.
Can I jump in and
Please.
provide a few comments myself? So I think the transformation that they talk about where the system is going is driven by Medicaid, and all states are kind of going through that. The details of how you get there, as Susan described, every state is working out, and so the funding system that the state of Maryland is working on, the feds, obviously within parameters, let the states decide what that looks like. And so I think on the hopeful side of this, the new funding system is built on what they call the BRIC method. And so each hour of service is built around what should a direct service staff be paid, and then how much in addition do you need for administration and overhead. And in the original scenario and the updated scenarios, all of those hourly rates for direct service staff are higher than they are now. And so as we look at the minimum wage here and what we might be asking the county to cover that difference, that shrinks as this new system is in place. And so I think I'm optimistic that I think I gave the council kind of worst case scenarios of how much it might cost. And that worst case scenario is still there because this could, all blow up and not work. But it's likely that something will come out of that, and it's likely that higher direct service rates will be part of that, and thus lessening the county's obligation to help us meet the higher minimum wage here.
And the other hopeful thing is that right now, it's gone back and forth, but right now they are saying that they are going to consider a rate differential for Montgomery County and a few other counties for there being a higher cost of living. And that has gone back and forth, so it's not until we know for sure it's final, but that was promising that they sort of landed there, that it did deserve a rate differential.
Well, that's promising. I'm glad to see we've been joined by Councilmember-elect and still Recreation Department Director Gabe Albornoz. We spoke earlier about how this study, which the council had asked for in 2017, really will provide a roadmap and a resource guide to the next set of elected officials who will be serving on the HHS committee as well as for the full council and the executive branch.
If I add, in conjunction with what Susan and Tim have said, it's really difficult for organizations that are providing supports to know how we're going to provide supports moving forward. Right now, supported employment for an organization such as the Treatment and Learning Centers, yes, we help with job coaching, helping them to be successful on the job, but we also get the call from the person saying, you know, I had an argument with my coworker down the hallway, and so we're calling the employer, we're calling the individual, we're helping them resolve those issues, or their boyfriend and girlfriend issues, their social security issues, housing, all of those things we're doing right now under support employment because we're paid a rate that allows us to do that. With moving forward, you know, we're not going to be able to provide those sort of supports. And if you don't have housing, you don't have money's coming in, you're going to have problems on the job. You know, we're dealing with people right now, somebody just had a death in their family. And so we're helping this individual through supported employment, helping them work with the employer so they can get the time off to deal with what they have to deal with. And we're going to have a lot more restrictions the way the new system's looking.
Understood. Thank you. That's a vivid example.
Some system-wide recommendations from the work group. I just wanted to say that while these are recommendations of the work group, I had put out the request per the council for departments to participate in the work group, and the executive was very cooperative, and so we had several departments that participated. But I did just want to say that as we go through these recommendations, they have not been vetted by the county executive or department heads, so they are really consensus recommendations of the work group, not necessarily endorsed by anybody in the executive branch. Okay?
Well, in the work group, this report is at the request of the council.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. So the first two recommendations really have to do with what you just discussed. So number one is the Montgomery County Executive and Council must partner with the General Assembly delegation to receive regular.
Sorry, could we get a copy of the slides to Mr. Albornoz?
Must partner with the General Assembly delegation to receive regular progress reports on the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Administration's transformation plan. The progress report should focus on real impacts to individuals, families, and providers. Is the transformation plan resulting in increases or decreases to the time individuals remain on waiting lists? Is it changing the quality of services provided?
What is the reason people are on waiting lists so long? Is it just lack of funding? People apply sooner and they get services sooner, and it's just first come, first served based on money? Is there anything else?
They have to find a provider that can meet their needs, and increasingly providers are concerned about expanding in a climate like this where you don't know.
And there are funding issues, and you'll see later one of the recommendations is around funding. But they have only so much funding for so many of the different kinds of waivers, and they have priorities for how people are taken off the lists. But some people do stay on for many, many years.
And how do our waiting lists in Montgomery County compare to other jurisdictions? Are we serving relatively more or less of a percentage of the population in need?
I can't really answer that.
Right, but that's a useful statistic. What would be good to know is if Montgomery County's service providers are meeting a larger amount of the need relative to what other counties are meeting, or is there this huge waiting list comparable everywhere?
Yeah, the data isn't really there by counties because the state's divided into sort of 4 regions that we're lumped in with 5 counties. Probably could get the state, data count region by region, but they've always struggled with giving us county data.
Okay.
Can I just follow up on that? Because I think that, again, as a part of the progress reports, that's always been the challenge. My conversations with Uma when it came to trying to figure some of this out when I first joined the council, coming from the General Assembly, to where I had done a lot of work on trying to focus on the waiting list and us putting funding behind it. So, Mr. Chair, what you're talking about is exactly right. A large chunk of it is the funding aspect because, again, if providers don't have the assurance, not only just on a national level, but also on a statewide level, an assurance that those funds will continue to be there, trying to expand and serve more folks and not knowing whether or not that funding is going to be there in the following year is incredibly concerning to them from a staffing perspective as well as everything else. And so I think that, again, having some sort of coordination between us and the General Assembly, I don't think we've done a great job of that. I'm just going to say, as a person who was at the General Assembly, who was there and who's here now, I don't think that we've really coordinated on this particular issue. And so I think it will be incredibly helpful for us moving forward to start forging some of those cohesive relationships, really working with the key folks that are on the various committees in Annapolis to ensure that we have those constant conversations about not only what's going on and stop playing defense, but also playing offense. I remember the disability community came together, and I think it was either 2007 or 2008, to really push Governor O'Malley to focus on the waiting list. I know I attended this reception, and the entire reception was devoted just to talking about reducing the list. But I don't remember remember hearing about any kind of concerted effort like that since then. And so I really think that, again, it behooves us around this time frame to really start doing that again. You're gonna.
And Linda, I'll just say, if you look at recommendation number 4, it says DDA needs to use its full budget allocation to support more people instead of ending the year with surpluses, which it continues to do. And there's your answer to solving the waitlist problem.
Thank you.
We're going to have to, Whitney, I'll allow you to ask a question, but we're on television, so people are watching who are not in this room. So if you want to ask a question, you need to come up, speak in the microphone, and introduce yourself, which you're welcome to do.
And I don't know exactly, I know there was allocations for 2 new waiver programs, and there are very few have been accepted into that program. The process for getting those 2 new waivers going, they revised the application process 3 times. As all the pain you've heard, it was another painful process. I don't know what the surplus was, but I know it's out there, and it wasn't used.
And so the information that we got from Legislative Services was that in FY18, DDA ended the year with a $27.6 million surplus in general funds. So they have a variety, obviously, of funding sources. In 17, they ended with a surplus of 35.7 in general funds, and in FY16, a surplus of 16.8 million. And I think that they can end with a surplus if they have a swing where they leverage more federal funds. We see that even sometimes at the county, but they do end with substantial general fund surpluses.
So in a moment. So it strikes me that probably these should have been included in the list of priorities that the executive and council transmit to our legislative delegation. And it might also be useful how many want to attend, but if we could work through our Office of Intergovernmental Affairs to have a briefing on this report for members of the Montgomery County delegation, whosoever is interested and willing to take such a briefing. If we could request that our Intergovernmental Affairs Office set up an opportunity like that. Mr. Rice.
Linda, did DLS report as to whether or not those surpluses were then utilized by the general fund, or if they were just kept in the department?
From what I understood, they fell back as surplus to the general fund.
Yeah,
So,
of course they did. Okay, thank you. Just wanted to be sure.
okay. So I'm going to go back to recommendation number 2, which is about the rate setting study that you've also discussed. And it says the county executive and council must carefully monitor the ongoing rate setting study and advocate strongly for rates that reflect the cost of doing business in Montgomery County. Services must be funded in a manner that allows providers to afford to continue to provide services. And I think you've heard some good examples of why this recommendation came forward.
No question. So if recommendation 2 is going to be implemented, it would be the HHS committee that would need to do that. So I'm leaving, but I would recommend that the next HHS committee schedule an update on the rate setting study in the first quarter of 2019.
The third recommendation is the focus on opportunity for employment is critical, but the county must advocate with DDA to ensure that new rules truly incentivize employment. We're going to get to the white paper on employment, and I think perhaps then is a good time to talk about this again, because when you look at the report, you'll see that some of the concern is what are the definitions of, meaningful employment, and will you really end up creating more employment opportunities or fewer, which you've already heard a little of that comment from the panel, but we'll have some recommendations specifically on employment later, and then we can have a fuller discussion of those issues if that's okay. DDA should use its full budget allocation to support more people instead of ending the year with surpluses. The county must continue to invest local funds to support providers, increase inclusion in county programs, and provide needed services to county residents with developmental disabilities who are either on a wait list or not eligible for DDA services. In the report at pages 20 to 22, I did want to say there's information on FY19 county funding. This is county government funding. There's over $22 million in supports for what's called the Community Services Network. The main component is the $17.5 million that you provide to the direct service organizations, but it also includes the additional funding for coordination of community services and the My Turn program, amongst other things. And in addition, we also have funding for respite. We have funding through the Department of Recreation. We have funding through the Housing Initiative Fund. And there's also in FY19 over $1.7 million in non-competitive awards, both grants and base budget non-competitive awards to nonprofit organizations. So that's also included in your report. So I think that there was a lot of discussion about how important each of those things are, but I wanted to give you the magnitude of what the county investment is at this point. And don't forget about those who are not eligible for DDA services. And I'd actually like, if anybody at the panel would like to discuss a little of this, it was very interesting. So we had a lot of discussion about, and this comes in with transitioning youth too, but in school, services are an entitlement. And in the adult system, they are not. And some of the eligibility criteria change. And so some families will see that while their child was eligible to get services as having a disability as a school-age child, for some reason they're not then eligible to get services as an adult. So, so the work group wanted to make sure this was in here. And I think I'd ask if anybody could provide any comment a little bit on that as well.
Well, I think that goes back to the wider umbrella, the larger spectrum. People who have a lesser degree of autism, for example, may not be eligible to meet the criteria that DDA has for lifelong services.
And does that also account for part of the wait list issue, that some clients' circumstances are just not that acute?
I don't think that would be reflected on the wait list, because the wait list should be people that are approved for DDA services.
And then number 7 is residents with developmental disabilities face the same issues as the general population. They're aging, they're more culturally and language diverse, they face barriers to employment if they are ex-offenders. These are all the things we talk about in our general population, and I think that the work group had a lot of discussion about, you know, people with developmental disabilities. They fit all those same categories.
So that's another one that I'm very curious about, because as we talk about expansion of our developmentally disabled community, do we see that community growing more diverse? As we see our general populace here in Montgomery County growing more diverse, which speaks back to my last comment/question that was about misdiagnosis before. Because especially in our communities of color, to where we know that kids were oftentimes pigeonholed into other types of things in terms of them actually having a disability, and attributed it to just not paying attention and just not being a good student or whatever the case may be, and actually had some other sort of disability. I'm just curious as to whether or not we're seeing that same sort of trend that follows in terms of the community growing more diverse, or was it always diverse from the beginning?
So it's an issue that at Jubilee we've been looking at, as we've looked at who we serve, and in comparison to the demographics of Montgomery County, and what's striking to us is how underrepresented Asian and Latino families are in what we're serving. And I would suspect that that's the case generally. Those populations have ballooned as a percentage of the county in the recent decades, and we certainly don't see them in the people that we're serving. We see some of them, but not to the percentage. And so I do think there are issues of doing a better job of including certainly racial diversities in who we serve.
You know, it's interesting because in talking with our communities, specifically our minority health initiatives, and talking about stigmas, and that oftentimes is the biggest challenge amongst our communities of color, ones in which they avoid the mental health. And the reason why I'm doing this is for Men's Health Month and continuing to try and grow awareness around the fact that, especially amongst men of color, not acknowledging the fact of mental health issues, but also if you're not acknowledging your own mental health, are you really going to acknowledge the fact that you have a child who's, you know, having some sort of things that you've identified as different, but you're not ready to take that next step to accepting the fact that it may be developmental disability or whatever the case may be. And so I'm just curious as to whether or not those same sort of lines that we see in our minority health initiatives, and whether they may not be helpful in terms of getting to that. Because I agree with you, Tim. I mean, you know, I've been at all of your functions, and that's what I continue to see, whether I go to ARC, whether I go to Jubilee, whether I go to TLC, whatever the case may be. And I don't see the same makeup that I see in our overall community. And I think to myself, well, that's interesting, because, and I think, again, just anecdotally, I don't think that there's a difference. So I feel as though it's people not accepting and saying that, you know, I want my child to be enrolled and to have the supports that are there. And so
that's a defensible speculation, but we don't know.
Right, that's why I'm
that
asking.
Incidence differs by demographic background.
Right.
Does the Larson method, which I understand is a statistical sampling form of estimating, does that give insight into whether the incidence of autism is evenly spread among every subpopulation?
I don't recall that detail being in the OLO report, but I could check.
The research, though, has found it in all demographics and in all, you know, socioeconomic. They didn't see any difference in the research that's been done up to now. I do think, though, that Craig's point about, you know, I think we're always mindful about that. I think it might depend on the service a little bit. It's like Jubilee does residential services, and I do think there could be a difference in whether certain cultures would have, you know, requests for residential, whereas in day services, which is more like school, there might be a higher, you know, representation of certain populations, and also, you know, what level of need. But we at CSS have seen a pretty diverse applicant population, both in the school and in the day services and in the after-school requests. It's been extremely diverse, and I've never done the math, which we could certainly do. And it would be interesting to compare that against the county's data, because you do have that data. So I think I'll do that. That's an interesting idea.
It would also be interesting to compare with the school system statistics, because we've always heard that minorities are overrepresented in special education classes. Right. And I understand that special education is a much wider umbrella than just the subpopulation that we're talking about of developmental disabilities, but it includes that subpopulation, and so it seems like there's a disconnect if the service providers are accessing non-representative component of the population, and yet the school system, we're always hearing, serves overrepresented in special education of minority populations. It would be worth getting some understanding of who are we missing and why. Ms. Chen.
Yes, so I just wanted to make a couple of comments. For those of you that know, my sister is developmentally disabled. I also worked for the Maryland Developmental Disabilities Council, state for siblings with developmental disabilities. So I wanted to make a comment on diversity, as I actually brought this up in the work group. Historically, developmental disability, the industry as a whole, has not been a culturally competent service industry at this, not yet. And the reason why is because it's so difficult already to access access services for anyone. So you've got to have, the first set of people need to get the access, or the ones that have the resources, have the pathways, have the channels, have the acceptance, and then you have the rest that need to. There's absolutely no difference amongst race or socioeconomic level based on whether you have a developmental disability. There are differences based on whether you're diagnosed, and there's absolutely differences on whether you have access. Across the board, Montgomery County is better, but it is still, the system-wide is set up for white, affluent people with developmental disability to access services first.
And it's a question of agency. When I think about the leaders who have been advocates over the years, and I'm thinking about Susan Hartung, I'm thinking about Lyda Astro, both of whom are here, they know a lot about how to work the system. They're very, very familiar with the levers of power and who runs the school system and who's in charge at the county council and how do you get in touch and how do you get your voice heard. And so it's a great struggle to face a challenge like this in your family. And yet what we see, Jane Salzano, we think about community leaders who founded institutions to serve this community. They already possessed a fair amount of knowledge of the system. I'm amplifying what you're saying. Yeah. Whereas other subpopulations or who may be newer to the county, there's a whole lot of other barriers to get past in terms of figuring out how things work and who's in charge that the longstanding participants have long ago mastered.
My point in the work group that I've met was that Montgomery County has an opportunity to be ahead of the curve on this. This is going to be the next thing in the developmental disability community that's going to hit, is that it needs to address more races, more socioeconomic levels, and we're primed for that because we've already got our system down. So I think this isn't something to necessarily just glaze over and say, we're just really diverse and that's great and we need to serve people. We actually have the system in place to be able to do this first because it's not known and it's very difficult to do nationwide. Like, we're so much far ahead.
So I'm just thinking here that, it would be worth knowing the demographic composition of the waiting list, but you have to be pretty sophisticated just to get on the waiting list. You have to be aware of where resources are and how to sign up, and then you have to wait for years. So there's a lot of hurdles to get over, especially in the immigrant community, if English language skill is not as strong and understanding where to go and what forms to fill out. There's a lot of hurdles to get over.
And as we're working on this group, things are always coming across our desks, but Respectability, in the midst of putting this report together, issued a toolkit that was specifically for Latino and Latina students, how to succeed in school, information for their parents and caregivers, all in Spanish. So it is clear that people are really, they're recognizing this and starting to work on it, but this was sort of one of the first toolkits that was done completely in a different language focused on.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Right, so again, I won't be here, but addressing some of these issues of outreach and communications to underrepresented subpopulations would be a good topic for the HHS committee to return to in 2019.
And not even just that, Mr. Chair, if I may, when it comes to our partners, to be able to take a look at, get a snapshot of what you see in terms of your cohorts of folks and figure out where we are to see
who are you missing?
Who are we missing?
And why?
That'll be incredibly helpful. Because I know, again, just to be very clear, and Carolyn kind of touched on this, this is about money also. Let's just be real about this. And so from that perspective, not being able to have the resources or know the fact that resources are there, that's also about money. You don't have to be ultra rich to still know, but you're still well off in knowing that, I know if I can pick up the phone and call this person or call that person, that's going to get me started and get me down. It's still a hard path to follow, but at least if you have some resources, you're able to do those kinds of things. But if you don't have 5 hours in a day to commit to doing some of this research and then picking up the phone and calling people and finding out what forms you need and all those kinds of things because you're working 2 jobs, that's the difference, right? And so it can be incredibly, for those folks who know, like you had mentioned about Lyda and others, who have rolled up their sleeves and really done so much work and spent hours upon hours upon hours fighting and advocating for their children, then you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, how does this person who doesn't even have, any of that time or the luxury of having that time make it work, right? And it's not to say that those folks didn't. They figured it out themselves too, but it's incredibly hard. And so, it may require some work for us to do in terms of figuring out ways to help bridge that gap that exists to help folks as a facilitator to get folks involved in understanding about these particular programs and things that we have. I just want to close by saying one thing on this point. We've been talking about this for a very long time. We have a lot of programs that do a lot of great work in the county, and a lot of people, especially the people who need it the most, are the ones who don't even know that they exist. And that's across the board. That's not just for developmental disabilities. That's for our homeless population. That's for business people out there who are smart people who've started businesses and have no idea about the resources that we have, and that we have a small business navigator that can help them, right? They have no idea. These are the kinds of things that and I've tasked myself with for this next 4-year term to make sure that we work on. So I look forward to working with each and every one of you as we move forward over this next 4-year term to really start to focus on that, making sure that all of our folks in our community know and understand the great work that you do and how you can help and be advocates and be supportive, because there are unfortunately too many people, and that's why they're also resistant, because they think that it's a death sentence, because once you acknowledge the fact that this is there, then there are no resources, and that it's going to mean even more of a challenge for me, and how am I going to be able to put up with or deal with what it is? It seems daunting, right? But if they knew the resources that were there for them, the support mechanisms that were in place, I think more people would be more accepting. That's just, again, my own personal thoughts, but you were going to say something, I'm sorry.
Mr. Rice, I agree with that. And we've seen within the treatment and learning centers individuals who were working with providers, had DDA funding. They lose their DDA funding because, again, they don't understand what all needs to be done. There's lack of education. Then they'll end up in the DOOR system. Autism is one that we've worked with several times, and they end up in the DOOR system. Well, then we might be able to help them, but it's very short-term limited. And then they get put on the DDA waiting list for the next 15 years until their family's 75 or 80 years old, and they can get services.
So we have a slide for each of the white papers that just summarizes the recommendations, but I just wanted to say that each of the white papers has a definition of the topic area, the eligibility by age group, a description of programs and services, some data and trends, identified gaps, innovations where we could identify them, and then recommendations. And the first one is coordination of community services, which you'll remember more as resource coordination, which the HHS committee was very involved with a few years ago. So this is an excerpt of the recommendations, and this is actually on pages 24 through 28 of the report. The council and executive should inform the governor and delegation that the implementation of the transformation plan is causing confusion for CCS providers, stress and disruption for people with IDD and their families. All CCS providers.
Hey, let's stop on that. Should we send a letter? Should we? How would we inform? What form would that take? Should this committee send a letter, or should we? I mean,
if you wanted to do this in follow-up with OIR with the delegation, and then see if they wish to join, we could follow up that way.
so that would be an early action item for the new HHS committee.
Okay.
I'm giving you a whole lot of homework assignments, Mr. Albornoz. Fortunately, you're going to have excellent staff.
All CCS providers, including DHHS, should be staffed at the 1:35 ratio, and CCS providers believe that a 1:25 ratio is appropriate given the responsibilities with person-centered planning. The council should review DHHS staffing ratio as a part of the FY20 budget. And I actually just wanted you to get a little bit of a comment on the person-centered planning, how that's different. And maybe, Kim, you could just tell them a little bit how the work is different now.
Yes, so prior to this year, it used to be called individual plan, and now it's a person-centered plan. It requires a great deal more work on the coordinator's part in terms of really trying to get to know the clients and individuals, which is a great thing, but just in terms of
That came
workload.
from DDA.
It did, and the concept is great. The problem is with high caseloads, it's hard for the coordinators to have time to meet with each client and really give them the attention they deserve. So it's a big workload on that. And then with the PCP, working with providers, I think there's been some confusion about the roles of each person in the process. DDA has recently given information out that's clarified it, but it's just been a process. Once again, it's been a little painful.
So it sounds good in concept, but if you don't have the resources.
Right, exactly. That's the obstacle we're running into.
But can I just say, the person-centered planning is also, according to DDA, now going to determine the funding level of the recipient getting services from DDA. So it's the HRST, the SIS, but come together with this PCP, so it's everything. It's the big, you can't ignore that, yeah.
But it's the right approach to take. It's just a question of, is it funded?
Correct, but yes.
If I might add, because my family's just about to embark on this with our son in the next couple weeks. And professionally, I've been involved with person-centered plans before, so I'm not afraid of it. But my son is nonverbal, so just for his case manager to be able to get to know him the way, say, even close to the way my husband and I know his preferences and what would be good for him in the community. It takes a lot of doing, and it also takes a lot of input from other people.
Yes.
The staff that work with him, the people who've known him over time, obviously the family, and that in itself is going to be more time consuming, as I understand it. So I'm anxious to see how it will all play out.
And Kim, how much of CCS is being allocated to develop this? How much time?
Oh, well, I mean, the requirement is that you meet with a person 4 times a year. And, but oftentimes it takes more than that, right? So that's part of the issue with, once again, with the rate and having a large caseload. And then the expertise of the CCS. This is a very involved process. So ideally you would have someone with some level of experience and knowledge. And as you know, there continues to be problems with turnover, especially in the private agencies for the CCS.
And I think when we had the CCS discussion, some of the private providers also raised a lot of concerns about the lack of written down policies and rules and regulations. So they get different answers to different questions, especially if they're working in more than one region. And so that's all having to be worked through as they're being asked to do these new, more complicated plans as well.
And if I may add quickly, within the provider agencies also, our time commitment involved with the person-centered plan is a lot more. And it's very different based on the CCS organization we're working with. So you're going from 1 or 2 hour plans to 4 hour plans. So that makes a big difference on the time commitments that our team needs.
DDA and Montgomery County should work together to fund a flexible program for adults similar to the HHS My Turn program, which serves children aged 3 to 13. And this is a county-funded program that you'll see a description of in the report that does provide some flexible funding for children who need adaptive services or, some activities.
And that should be consistent with the concept of a person-centered plan.
Yes, except that they're not, in the My Turn program, they're not currently receiving.
Right. They can't be
Receiving state services.
from DDA or MSDE. They can't be any of the.
So that's a way of helping people who are on the waiting list.
Right. Okay. The next white paper is employment, and some of the recommendations are undertake a gaps analysis in the county for employment, underemployment, and unemployment of people with IDD. Look at the continuum of employment supports for people with severe to mild IDD. This next one was something the work group really talked about. The county should create its own vision of meaningful employment and advocate with the state for its vision. And I think if folks at the table want to add to that, but you've already heard from them really concerns about, is what the state is proposing really going to help with employment? And there was a lot of agreement that the county should also just work on its own vision and then advocate with the state for that. Promote and award businesses with successful programs for hiring people with disabilities in partnership with the Chambers of Commerce, MCEDC, WorkSource Montgomery, strengthen partnerships with economic development, and advocate for a rate structure and billing system that keeps organizations financially stable and supports drop-in visits and phone supports. And perhaps, Karen, I don't know if you want to comment a little on how the partnerships with the private sector work, because that is where you end up helping people get employment, or if you wanted to comment on any of the other items.
I guess, it's working with businesses and employers today. Expectations are really changing. People are doing 3 and 4 jobs. In the past, I've been in the field a long time. So you used to be able to find a job for somebody that would be doing a stock clerk type position. But nowadays you have to do stock clerk, you have to be a cashier, you have to do all these other things. So I think there's a lot of challenges for individuals that we support that may be able to do many of the tasks but can't do all of them. And to work with an employer to carve out a position is not necessarily real attractive to some employers in Montgomery County, because they're like, I've got to get all these jobs done. And it takes a long time to develop a relationship. We have done it, we've had some success, but it may take you 6 months to a year to develop those relationships so that you can get jobs in there for people with different employers. And the challenge with that is, under the new funding system, how are we going to be able to do that for individuals? Because now my job developers can go out and work with employers and not necessarily have to have one person in mind. They develop that relationship. Moving forward with some of the changes that may occur, agencies may only be able to work for that one person, and that's a very different type of job development.
Very interesting. The second and third bullets here really need to be combined. When we talk about the county creating its own vision, that shouldn't mean county government, right? That should mean the whole population of the county, including the institutions that represent employers. And the organizations that advocate for workers. I mean, if there's going to be some sort of exercise to carry out bullet 2, it ought to be, very inclusive. I mean, labor unions, a wide range of organizations that are in the workplace.
The next white paper is on health and okay.
So I just wanted to ask a question about the relationship between, I know that WorkSource Montgomery oftentimes tries to help with some of our harder to place residents. And so I'm just curious as to what the experience has been from anyone in terms of working with WorkSource Montgomery when it comes to being able to place folks who may have developmental disabilities.
We've worked some with WorkSource Montgomery, and it's been helpful on one end that they often will have job fairs and that sort of thing available that we can take individuals to. But for some of our individuals with developmental disabilities, a lot of the jobs are not really appropriate for that individual, where maybe the individuals we serve through doors might be a more appropriate individual.
See, and the reason why I was asking that is because I think that part of this is much more challenging than we give it credit for in terms of what's here, because when I think about economic development, which we've prioritized, their job is not employment. Their job is growing employers. And so certainly by establishing relationships with those employers to get them to understand about hiring all of our residents, including those with developmental disabilities, that's certainly something, but again, is not their number one charge. So who really then is, and this is a part of the challenge that we're going to face. From my perspective, I already saw it with the folks who are the highest unemployed, which are our young people of color. And certainly also coupled with that is folks with disabilities. And so it's one in which it's an interesting conundrum, because there's no one out there to work on making sure that those folks get jobs. There's no entity or agency. That's why I was asking about WorkSource, because I just know from my own anecdotal experience, but I mean, they're even challenged with dealing with our young people of color and trying to get them employed. So if they can't even get great success with that, I can only imagine what's happening with our people with disabilities. And so from that perspective, we've got to have someone or an entity that's actually doing this kind of thing if we want to see it happen. I know individually, you guys do your own in terms of advocating, and I've been to multiple events to where you do that and establish those relationships. I mean, Project Search, who's done a great job of trying to do that with county government and with some of the other outside entities. But I think the point that you made at the very beginning is one that is incredibly important. And this is something that we're going to have to consider. Because I was just talking with our staff director here and advocating and saying I wanted to see more Project Search people here at the county council. And the response I got was that, well, when they looked at last year, because we had one person, and the fact that our employees have to do multiple things now, right? So it's not just a person who's doing copying or doing, and copying the packets, exactly what you said. And that runs across the gamut for everything. And so then what is that true vision for what it is that we want to see when we know that a person at McDonald's, where I used to work, when I used to be the drive-through cashier, and that's all I did, right? Or I was, at the front doing the cashier there, but now you have people who run the shifts and they do everything, right? And so there is no longer a stay in my lane type job. It's one in which they expect you to do a little bit of everything and be a jack of all trades. And so if that's the case, then what happens for our folks who can do 2 out of the 5 tasks?
Right, and then how do you structure the supported employment in such a way that it's worthwhile for the employer maybe to alter his or her work practices in order to benefit from participating in the program? There's got to be enough incentives for the employers to make it economically feasible and profitable.
And then who is the one who's able to tell employers that that's what you're going to do?
Well, and how does that fit with the new rules? I mean, I think this was the thing. So I would
Right.
say, like, our nonprofit organizations currently, and you all just actually recognized Jessa a week or so ago, right? So our nonprofit organizations right now are the ones really placing the most people. But I think some of the concerns we had was, what if you have a restaurant, for example, that is happy to employ somebody who's going to roll silverware? It's a task they need done, but it's no longer fits as a competitive job that's open to everybody, that has like room for advancement and all those kinds of things. Even if you had an employer who wants to do that, the concern that was raised is that going to meet the new definitions? And that's really sort of how I think the group ended up in this discussion about, like, we all really need to sit down and create a vision and advocate for it, because the group, at least what I would hear, was not convinced that the current rules are going to really incentivize and increase employment opportunities. Is that?
Right, and then the consequences of that is if you go ahead and bill for that as a provider agency as competitive integrated employment for each hour of that service, someone comes in and audits it and says, no, that doesn't meet the definition, you're liable for repayment
Right,
of all
of
of
course.
that.
Yeah.
So providers are getting pretty nervous about this whole Medicaid fraud issue and whether or not we'd be hit with triple fines and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so this is something where, again, Mr. Albornoz, we as a committee are going to have to spend some serious time on this. I mean, really, I'm very concerned because it's going back from, at least we had made some progress when it comes to employment, and I'm starting to see that as a trend that may head backwards, and that is going to be incredibly concerning for those, especially as we tried to move people into supportive housing to where they were living independent lives, but if they're not able to be gainfully employed any longer, what that then means for them and how that disrupts all of those things that we've put in place. So this has serious ramifications, I think, that requires us to really take a very long, hard look at and figure some strategies out that are going to help us to move forward.
And just going back to the experience of the person-centered plan that we're about to embark on, my son has worked pretty much for the last 10 years part-time at Taco Bell, doing some of those kind of jobs you're talking about. Well, my person-centered plan is that he's doing great. I want him to continue, gets a lot of satisfaction from that, and I hear he's a really great worker. But if it doesn't work into this so much for the person-centered plan as far as I'm concerned.
Right. Very challenging. And here again, you can understand how the intent is well-meaning. It's the implementation that's the problem. So,
The next white paper was on health and wellness, and the recommendations are to increase awareness and education of health and wellness coverage and services as individuals with IDD age out of the school system, to minimize gaps in coverage, and provide educational opportunities for physicians, dentists, psychiatrists, therapists, and medical dental providers to obtain training on working with individuals with IDD. Advocate that this issue be included in curriculum for the training of medical, dental, and behavioral health providers. I did note we had a lot of discussion about the specific needs of people with IDD and mental health, behavioral health co-occurring issues. And there's just definitely, a shortage of people who have any particular expertise or training in working with this population.
Yeah, so here again, we've got to work with our state-level officials. We really need to have some mechanism to convey these recommendations to the governor and his cabinet and to our General Assembly members.
The next white paper was on housing, non-institutional housing. And an excerpt of the recommendations, this is actually in your report, it's pages 42 through 48. More affordable housing for people with IDD at all stages of life. Reflecting county policy on affordable housing, it should be provided throughout neighborhoods in all parts of the county. Ensure individuals who need 24/7 caregiver are eligible for a 2-bedroom MPDU.
So that's something the county could do.
Right, and I'm pretty sure, I did talk with DHCA, they said they will make allowances for that, but there was concern that sometimes people are told they can only qualify for a 1-bedroom unit and they have a caregiver. Use new MPDU provisions to allow people with IDD to access MPDUs during the priority marketing period. And we're working on the system for that. That law was just recently effective. Develop residential programs for individuals with Prader-Willi syndrome who need 24/7 restricted access to food as a result of the syndrome. And support HOC with applying and advocating for additional housing choice vouchers.
Very good.
Yep.
Sure.
A few comments, and Councilmember Leventhal, you'll remember you had a report done, maybe 18 months ago that looked specifically at that, and so this really builds, I think, on those recommendations. It does a nice job of summarizing that. I would just add a couple things. As I said in my testimony before that report, there's this fear that, what's going to happen to group homes. Neither Medicaid nor DDA is saying group homes are going away. Group homes are allowable under the new rules. They'll continue to be there. I think a lot of the new development is going to look different. So we're talking about trends, but we're not talking about eliminating that as an option. I think in addition to the recommendations in the report, I think a lot of affordable housing, almost all of it is done using tax credits and leveraging tax credits, I think is a very important strategy. Working with Montgomery Housing Partnership, with HOC, et cetera. The Main Street project is an example of the layering of that.
Great example.
And the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, in their use of the Housing Initiative funds, have really done a great job of leveraging funds to help projects work, and I think we want to build on that as a strength. So we're not in a situation of really dysfunction at the county level. I think we're in a situation of building on strengths and kind of adapting to the new realities.
Thank you. I apologize.
The next white paper was on law enforcement and public safety, including fire and rescue. I actually did just want to say that our police department has a particularly wonderful Officer Reyes, who's been a leader in the training and advocate, and the department also has a self-advocate ambassador named Jake Edwards, who goes out as a part of that effort. And so I did just want to mention that was one of our innovations was our own. So the recommendations are continue funding needed to make sure specialized training is provided to law enforcement and fire and rescue personnel as a part of recruit school and in-service training. Consider additional funding for MCPD search operations team to make sure resources are available to respond to missing at-risk persons calls. Create outreach education campaigns for parents on when and how to call the police or alternative resources, such as the mobile crisis team. Help families create scripts on what to say. Families can be scared to call, fearing they will be referred to Child Protective Services. Discuss with law enforcement.
Is that a valid fear?
Yes.
Discuss with law enforcement their expertise transporting individuals with IDD to hospitals and psychiatric facilities.
Can I just ask a question as to whether or not, with a lot of our families who may not have documentation, being concerned about calling the police when it comes to crimes being committed against them, I assume the same would hold for calling the police in these kinds of situations as well. And so you may have a person who has a child or young teen who's acting out, who may have developmental disabilities, who's not going to call for that same sort of fear. Anecdotally, do we know anything about that? Have there been conversations about that and what we can do as far as outreach from that perspective as well, if anybody? If not, then that's fine. I just think it's something we may want to take a look at as well.
I think we're a little confused as to are you asking?
The Latino community is afraid that if they call the police, they're going to get picked up by immigration. And so that is leading to a drop-off in school attendance. It's leading to a drop-off in participation at health clinics, a wide range of services that are available regardless of immigration status, but families don't want to avail themselves of it because the rhetoric from the federal government right now is so worrisome, and there's such a evident effort to crack down on illegal immigration. And so Mr. Rice is wondering whether the same issue may arise where a family may be afraid to report a circumstance with a developmentally disabled member.
It's adults that are at
Yes.
home who may have behavior issues, and people are being hurt in the home, but they're reluctant to call because the solution is to remove them from the home. But there are no openings or good places to take them.
Right.
Personally, I had to have my daughter was in the hospital at one point, and the solution we were given, well, there'll be an opening in a week in a facility that they think can handle her. So we went home.
That's right, we've gone home too.
Yeah.
Okay.
The next is recreation, and an excerpt of the recommendations are: development of new facilities should be planned intentionally for inclusion beyond the Americans with Disabilities Act. Provide specialized training for people interested in working with people with IDD in a variety of recreation programs to increase the number of staff that can safely handle situations with both children and adults. Recreation currently does not have staff that can assist people functioning at the level of a very young child or in need of personal care. Explore ways to leverage the use of volunteers and review funding and policies on the cost of fields, ice skating rinks, and pool time, which can be the biggest cost for a program.
Very good.
Respite care, and I would just say that the group recognized that some of this may require changes to the Maryland regulations to COMAR. So again, we would need to have state involvement. Increase flexibility of respite service parameters to make it more family-oriented instead of limiting services for the individual with the disability. Support opening a community respite house for children in Montgomery County where primary caregivers that have multiple children with and without disabilities could drop their children off. Respite should be able to care for children with challenging behaviors. Conduct a study on how many families are turned away due to income ineligibility, and develop a Montgomery County respite service fee scale so it is easier to make adjustments, address low state rate for nursing level respite. And you do actually in the stories, there's a story about the importance of respite, and sometimes it's the one time families can go out, they can take a break. So we hear from the Commission on People with Disabilities a lot about respite. Transitioning youth, again, you have some things in the stories about how stressful this can be. Some of the recommendations are coordinate MCPS employment services with employment programs around the county and engage employers directly to be a proactive stakeholder. Integrate transitioning youth planning with person-centered planning to increase coordination of services. Engage students earlier, even 1 year with state-funded services so families can work with CCS earlier. MCPS and the CCS should return to a practice of working together when the child is age 14 or younger. Provide clear information to parents about the different eligibility criteria for school systems and DDA so they can make informed choices. And I actually would just say, from being in the work group meetings, the message I came away with was you can't start too early informing families about how different the school system is from the adult services, and that includes eligibility criteria. Your child may have a disability while they're in school, and then they do not have a disability when they are an adult. The funding, how program choices may work. There's just a wide range of issues, and I think you can't start too early, and it's starting later now than it used to several years ago when they could work earlier, the CCS and the schools could work earlier together. In transportation, advocate with DDA to allow the county to reinstate the CAP program and other innovative options in partnership with the service provider. The CAP program was reliable and the provider knew the needs of the individual. And Susan, you could probably explain what the CAP program was, right? Because you had it.
Right. We still have a version of it that they kept in place, but the state chose not to continue it through MTA. It was a secretary grant, or no, yeah, I think so. Secretary grant initially, and we basically, in coordination with a private transportation company, use Metro Access dollars to fund that one company to provide same driver, same route, same vehicle, consistency. Because right now, when you place a call to Metro Access, they route it and it would be different, every potential trip, which created a lot of inconsistency and a lot of lateness and a lot of problems for people who have trouble with change. So this was a way to increase above paratransit level of service. It was even through door service. And it was very successful in allowing people to use Metro Access service at a much lower cost than the cost of a typical Metro Access trip. So it saved the state quite a lot of money in its first year. We managed to keep it going for 2 years, and then they ended up with a sort of a private grant to continue with the folks who come to our day services because they were unsuccessful on regular Metro Access. And the Metro Board viewed it as a precedent, so they kept it going. The vision had been that it would expand and other agencies would be able to use a similar service instead of the typical, Metro Access service. Since then, though, Metro went in a little bit different direction and they started something else, which is a same-day service, which has gotten pretty good reviews, I think, so far, which is through they had a grant, a particular cab company, Regency and Silver won that. And I'm blocking the name of it right now. Does somebody know? No, you can't. Okay. Anyway, there's another avenue now for getting, a little bit more consistency at a lower cost. But those are services that don't cost the county. These are definitely state. This is state money.
The county should work with WMATA for better background checks and safety measures to prevent criminal sexual assaults against passengers. The county should work with WMATA to ensure there are enough resources to pick people up on time and deliver them to their destination in a reasonable amount of time, and make sure that any options for senior transportation are made available to seniors with IDD. And waivers, and this goes back to the waiver structure, so some of these are back to your system-wide recommendations, which are the executive and council should partner with the delegation to receive regular progress reports on the implementation of the transformation plan. Evaluate whether the new structure of Maryland's waivers, which are more restrictive, is increasing or working against inclusion. Look to other states to see if Maryland is a model of excellence. Executive and council should carefully monitor the rate setting study, and the executive and council should receive updates on the impacts of the community settings rules on housing and programs.
Terrific. Well, what a great overview. All of the issues that I hope would have been addressed here: employment and housing and transportation and inclusion and all of this range of issues. So I just have always had a warm feeling towards the families that struggle with these challenges. I understand that it increases your depth of understanding of other people's suffering because of what you've been through, and so I just thank you for persisting and for your resilience as the families who encounter these challenges and the providers who have so much patience and generosity and caring for the clients. Many of the providers themselves have experienced these issues in their own families, and that's what led them into this line of work. So I just have to say that in my time here as HHS committee chairman, interacting with this community has been very, very satisfying for me. And I want to thank you for the work that went into this document, and I commend it to the next round of elected officials. I think it really gets off to a good start. We're not just ending the conversation with the end of this county council. We're enabling the next county council and the next county executive to take the baton and keep moving forward and keep providing for more inclusion and more opportunity for these people of every age and every income level. I think one of the things that we find with the HHS, the panoply of services that are provided under the jurisdiction of this committee, is that we're all often very focused on means testing and income eligibility because you have to ration, and yet the presence of an autistic child is not restricted to income. And as I say, I find that those families with an extraordinary amount of agency, who have learned how to work the system on behalf of their kids, then become advocates for everyone else's kids, and have a really big heart and a really caring temperament. So it's a community that I have a great deal of respect and appreciation for, and I thank you not only for this document, but for the work that we've been able to do together over the last 16 years. Mr. Rice.
Well, Mr. Chair, I just wanted to say thank you to you. And I've said this before, but you are truly the embodiment of a person who cares, because you could have easily said, my twilight is upon us and I'm going to exit. But you wanted to ensure up to the very last day that we continue the great work that under your leadership we've been able to do, and continue to build on that for the future. It says how much you care about the community. It shows how much you understand and appreciate the complexity of these issues and how much work needs to be done. You truly have been a great teacher for me. And I truly just want to say thank you. It's interesting, we always get time like this to think back. And it was you, Mr. Chair, who said, you're going to love it here on HHS. I promise you that. I wasn't sure whether or not I was going to love HHS. I was dead set on education and knew that I was going to be golden there. And I can't tell you how rewarding it's been. Because when you talk about the impacts, and there's great things that are happening in our education space, but each and every day you are seeing people who are struggling and challenged with so many things that unfortunately are sometimes crippling and debilitating, not just in terms of the illness, but for what it does for the families that are surrounding and supporting folks. And being able to make those kinds of things a little bit easier for folks, knowing that they're leading incredibly stressful and challenging lives, makes such tremendous difference. And you have a great career to look back on. You've helped so many people and made such an impact in this community. And everybody should be so appreciative of you for doing that down to the very last day. So thank you. That's very kind.
I know we all
It
feel.
really is the best committee.
I know. I just cannot leave without telling you how much work Linda and Carolyn put into this effort. It was above and beyond anything required to do, and obviously, to me at least, an effort of love. And we deeply, deeply appreciate it. And of course, both of you, thank you for everything you've done for so many years. And Kim for chairing it. Much needed.
All right, well, mutual admiration on all sides.
Yes.
Thanks to everyone.
You okay?
Thank you.
And with that, the Health and Human Services Committee meeting is adjourned.